What if I told you there might have once been a race of red-haired giants living in North America, real bones, real artifacts, and that evidence of their existence may have been quietly erased from history? Today, we're diving deep into a cave in Nevada that could hold the key to one of America's most forbidden archaeological mysteries. And we're going to ask the question, were the Giants of Lovelock real, and why were they forgotten? Deep in the Nevada desert lies a cave, quiet, unassuming, and easy to miss. But over a century ago, this cave shook the world of archaeology. Inside, miners claim to have unearthed mummified remains and massive bones belonging to humans far taller than anyone thought possible. The local Paiute tribe had long spoken of these red-haired giants, violent beings driven into the cave and burned alive. But what's legend? And what's history? Today, we'll peel back the layers of myth, science, and cover up to uncover the truth about the Giants of Lovelock Cave, America's forgotten ancient race. It all began in the barren heart of Nevada's desert, a place where the winds whisper through the sagebrush and the ground hides more secrets than it reveals. Around the early 1900s, two miners, David Pooh and James Hart, were exploring a remote region near the Humboldt Sink, just outside the small town of Lovelock. Their mission wasn't archaeology, it wasn't exploration. It was something far more practical and far less glamorous. They were searching for bat guano. Yes, bat droppings. Back then, guano was a valuable commodity used as a powerful ingredient in fertilizer and gunpowder. The miners had heard rumors that a particular cave nestled in the cliffs above the desert contained thick layers of the stuff, possibly tons of it. What they didn't realize was that beneath those layers of guano lay something far older, far stranger, and far more controversial than anything they could imagine. As Pooh and Hart began digging into the cave's dark interior, their picks struck something unexpected: artifacts. Not just random stones or broken tools, but intricately crafted items. The deeper they dug, the more they found: woven baskets, carved bones, ancient tools, and oddly shaped sandals so large that no ordinary human foot could have worn them. They thought they had stumbled upon a long-lost native settlement, but soon the evidence suggested something beyond that. The cave itself was massive, over 150 feet long and 35 feet high, its walls layered with sediment that hinted at thousands of years of occupation. As they cleared away more guano, the air filled with a strange, musty smell, not just from the droppings, but from something else, something decaying. That's when they made the discovery that would put Lovelock Cave on the map, the discovery of bones. At first, it seemed like they had found ordinary human remains, but soon it became clear these weren't normal. Some skulls were larger than average, the jaws broader, and the bones unusually thick. Local rumors began spreading fast. Rumors that these bones belonged to giants. Stories circulated of skeletons measuring anywhere between 7 to 10 feet tall. When the miners informed authorities and the University of California about their discovery, archaeologists and anthropologists arrived to investigate. Over the next several years, teams led by L.L. Loud and later M.R. Harrington conducted official excavations. What they found only deepened the mystery. They cataloged more than 10,000 artifacts, including duck decoys made of tule reeds, carved wooden tools, shell beads, and stone weapons. Among these items were massive sandals measuring up to 15 inches in length, and weapons so large they seemed built for someone far stronger than a typical human. But what captured everyone's imagination were the reports of red-haired mummies. According to local accounts, the miners had uncovered partially mummified remains of individuals with long strands of reddish hair still clinging to their skulls. Some claimed these remains stood well over 7 feet tall when measured. Even more bizarre, some of the skulls seemed to have features that didn't match those of the local Paiute people or any known indigenous group. Now here's where things get even more intriguing. The local Paiute tribe, who had lived in the region for centuries, already had a story, an ancient legend passed down through generations, about a race of red-haired, man-eating giants called the Siteka. According to their oral history, the Siteka were a savage race that terrorized their ancestors. They were said to be enormous in size, with pale skin and red hair, and they attacked and ate the Paiute people. Eventually, the Paiutes united against them, driving the giants into a cave. They piled brush at the entrance and set it on fire, killing the giants inside. The cave they described was eerily similar to the one Pooh and Hart had just uncovered. So now imagine this scene. You're in 1911 Nevada, standing at the mouth of a dusty cave. Two miners, their hands black with guano, are staring at oversized skulls and red hair clinging to bone fragments. Local tribespeople are whispering that the old stories are true, and archaeologists are rushing to the scene, unsure whether they're about to confirm an ancient myth or expose a hoax. The early excavations brought more strange finds: obsidian blades too heavy for normal human hands, handprints in clay that seemed larger than life, and even remains of food and tools suggesting the cave had been inhabited for centuries. But as with so many extraordinary discoveries, confusion and controversy soon followed. The original miners claimed they found full skeletons of giants before the official excavations began, skeletons that mysteriously disappeared once researchers arrived. There were whispers that some of the bones were sent to museums, possibly even to the Smithsonian, and never seen again. Reports from newspapers at the time, including the Nevada Review Miner, fueled the frenzy. They published stories about red-haired giants, ancient tools, and vanished remains. Some skeptics argued the red hair was simply dark hair that had turned rusty over time due to mineralization in the cave. Others dismissed the entire tale as exaggeration, a mix of minor folklore and local myth. But there were too many first-hand accounts, too many photos and field notes to simply ignore. Every object pulled from that cave seemed to whisper a story from a forgotten chapter of human history. Whether the inhabitants were unusually tall humans, an unknown prehistoric race, or something far stranger, one thing was clear: Lovelock Cave was no ordinary archaeological site. It was a portal into something that didn't quite fit the timeline we're told. And so what began as a simple search for fertilizer in a dusty Nevada cave soon turned into one of the most debated archaeological discoveries in American history, a story that would challenge scientists, excite conspiracy theorists, and leave behind a mystery that refuses to die. Long before miners ever stepped foot near Lovelock, long before scientists began sifting through the dust of that mysterious cave, the Paiute people already knew the story. It was an ancient tale passed down from elder to child for countless generations, whispered around fires under the Nevada stars. To them, the story wasn't myth or folklore, it was history. A history filled with blood, fear, and survival. According to Paiute legend, there once existed a race of fearsome beings known as the Si Te Ka. The name itself carried weight. In the Paiute language, it translates roughly to tule eaters, referring to the tule, reeds that grow thick around the marshes of Nevada's Humboldt Sink. These reeds were said to be used by the Si Te Ka not only for making boats and tools, but also as food dough that was far from their only source of sustenance. The Si Te Ka, as described in tribal accounts, were unlike any humans the Paiutes had ever encountered. They were giant, towering figures with light-colored skin and long, fiery red hair. Their strength was legendary, their cruelty even more so. These beings were said to be savage cannibals, raiding Paiute villages, capturing their people, and devouring them. They were relentless and violent, moving across the land like a plague. The Paiute people feared them deeply, but they also held a grim respect for their power. One of the most chilling details repeated in oral tradition is how the giants would call out during battle, their voices booming across the desert, taunting the Paiutes as they fled. The Paiutes said the Si Te Ka came from distant lands, possibly from the north, arriving in great reed boats that floated across ancient lakes that have long since dried up. Over time, they settled in the region, taking what they wanted and destroying anyone who stood in their way. Eventually, the Paiutes had enough. According to tribal stories recorded by early ethnographies, including Sarah Winmuka Hopkins, a respected Paiute author and educator, the tribes of the region united against their tormentors. They formed a confederation of smaller groups tribes that had once been rivals, brought together by the shared goal of eliminating the Si Te Ka once and for all. The final battle between the Paiutes and the red-haired giants was said to have taken place near what is now known as Lovelock Cave, The Paiutes chased the last of the giants into this cavern, cornering them inside. The Siteka, realizing they were trapped, tried to fight back with weapons and stones, but the Paiutes were relentless. The tribes gathered brush, wood, and dry reeds, piling them high at the cave's entrance. Then they set it on fire. Smoke filled the cave, thick and suffocating. The giants screamed and roared, but none escaped. The fire consumed everything inside. When it was over, the entrance was sealed, and the cave was left silent. The Paiutes declared victory, and the legend says the red-haired giants were never seen again. The cave became a place of fear and reverence, avoided for generations. To the Paiutes, it was sacred ground, a tomb for monsters that once terrorized their people. Centuries later, when miners and archaeologists entered Lovelock Cave and claimed to find giant skeletons and mummified remains with red hair, the Paiutes simply said, "We told you so." To them, this wasn't a shocking discovery, it was proof of what they had been saying all along. Their legends were not just stories, but eyewitness history passed through the ages. Anthropologists who later studied the Paiute oral traditions noted the striking consistency in these tales across different groups. The details remained the same. The giants were large, pale-skinned, red-haired, and cannibalistic. Even the method of their destruction, being trapped and burned in a cave, was described identically by multiple sources. For the Paiute, there was never any doubt that this had really happened. But where did such a story come from? Could it have been based on encounters with unusually tall or powerful neighboring tribes? Some scholars suggest the legend may have grown out of ancient conflicts over territory or resources. Others believe the story could preserve distant memories of real encounters with a now extinct branch of humanity, perhaps even remnants of an ancient culture lost to time. Then there are those who believe the Paiute legend is more than metaphor. Some alternative researchers argue that the story aligns with other indigenous myths from around the world that describe giants or tall ones living among humans in ancient times. From the Anunnaki of Mesopotamia to the Nephilim of biblical lore, stories of gigantic beings have persisted in nearly every culture on Earth. Could the Siteka have been America's version of that same phenomenon? When you line up the legend with the archaeology, the coincidences start to look a lot less like coincidences. Red-haired mummies were reportedly found inside the very cave where the Paiutes said the giants were trapped. Massive sandals and tools were uncovered in the same layers of sediment that date back to the period described in the oral history. Even the physical descriptions match the reddish hair, the unusual bone size, and the evidence of fire at the entrance of the cave. Of course, mainstream science dismisses most of these connections. Researchers say the hair color was the result of chemical changes after death, that the bones were those of normal humans, and that the fire evidence could have been caused by natural events or later occupation. But still, the legend refuses to fade. Every time someone brings up the story of Lovelock Cave, the red-haired giants rise again in the public imagination, larger than life, straddling the line between myth and history. The Paiutes never claimed their stories were fiction. They spoke of the Siteka as real beings who walked the earth, fought wars, and died in that cave. To them, the cave isn't an archaeological site, it's a burial ground for an ancient enemy. And whether those giants were human, something else entirely, or a symbolic echo of a dark chapter long forgotten, the legend of the red-haired giants continues to haunt the desert of Nevada. When the first official excavations began at Lovelock Cave in 1912, archaeologists expected to find the remnants of an ordinary ancient settlement, tools, pottery, and maybe some animal remains. But what they uncovered told a much stranger story. Beneath layers of dust and guano, they unearthed artifacts that seemed to belong to a people far different from the known native cultures of the region. Each discovery added to a growing mystery that no one could easily explain. The excavations were conducted primarily by Ella Loud of the University of California and later by archaeologist M.R. Harrington from the Museum of the American Indian. Together, their teams cataloged over 10,000 artifacts. Among the finds were baskets woven with extraordinary skill, duck decoys crafted from reeds and feathers that looked almost modern in design, tools made from stone and bone, and even carved wooden objects that had somehow survived the centuries. Yet the most puzzling discoveries were not the artifacts themselves, but the remains of the people who left them behind. Reports from the early diggers claimed that large human bones were found, bones that suggested individuals of unusual height and size. Some miners who had been there before the archaeologists arrived told stories of skeletons measuring 7, 8, even 9 feet tall. The bones, they said, were massive, the femurs thicker than any normal humans, the skulls heavy and broad, with prominent jawlines and large eye sockets. What caught everyone's attention was the hair, long reddish strands still clinging to some of the skulls. For the Paiute people, this was more than just interesting archaeology. It was confirmation of their legend. They had always spoken of red-haired giants, the Si Te Ka, who once ruled this land before being wiped out. And now, here were bones, artifacts, and hair that seemed to prove it. One of the most discussed pieces of evidence was a giant sandal, measuring about 15 inches long, far too large for an average human of that era. Alongside it were woven garments of unusual size, suggesting that whoever wore them had been built on a much grander scale. Stone mortar and pestles found in the cave were also oversized, requiring a level of strength far beyond the average person to use effectively. And then there were the skulls. Some early researchers described skulls with cranial capacities larger than normal, with distinct morphological features. Photographs from early newspaper reports showed skulls that appeared elongated, with exaggerated brow ridges and deep-set eyes. Critics argue that these were simply normal human variations, but the descriptions remain strikingly consistent, especially when compared to the Paiute accounts of large, powerful, red-haired beings. As excavations continued, archaeologists found evidence that the cave had been inhabited for thousands of years, layer upon layer of human occupation, dating back as far as 4000 BCE. Yet, even within these layers, something was off. The tools, the bones, and the burial arrangements didn't always match those of known Native American cultures. It was as if the cave's earliest inhabitants belonged to a different world entirely. One of the most fascinating finds was a set of duck decoys, 11 in total, which are now considered some of the oldest and best preserved in the world. They were made of tule reeds, painted, and even feathered to resemble real ducks. Their craftsmanship was extraordinary, suggesting a sophisticated culture capable of complex design and artistry. But even this incredible discovery was overshadowed by the lingering rumors of what else had been taken from the cave before archaeologists arrived. According to several accounts, miners who had first entered the cave in 1911 had found full skeletons, giant mummified remains, before the academic teams ever arrived. Some claim that these remains were later removed by local authorities and possibly sent to the Smithsonian Institution for study. Yet when researchers later tried to locate those bones, they were nowhere to be found. No official records, no documentation, and no trace. That disappearance has become one of the most controversial parts of the Lovelock story. Were these remains misplaced, destroyed, or intentionally hidden? Some say the skeletons never existed at all, the result of exaggerated minor tales. Others insist they were real, evidence of a race that mainstream science refuses to acknowledge. Adding to the intrigue were reports of unusual artifacts that didn't fit with the known technology of the region. Obsidian blades larger and heavier than practical use, hand-woven mats that seemed to belong to people of great stature, and even stone tools found deep in layers far older than expected. Some of the bones showed signs of burning, as though they had perished in fire, echoing the Paiute legend of the giants being burned alive in their final stand inside the cave. Even early scientists admitted that something about Lovelock Cave didn't make sense. The artifacts were real, the layers of occupation verifiable, yet the physical descriptions of the remains and their alleged disappearance created a puzzle that official reports struggled to explain. While the University of California's published findings made no direct mention of giants, many local witnesses, miners, and even early journalists swore that giant bones had indeed been found and quietly removed. Over time, skeptics have argued that the so-called giants were simply tall humans or that the stories were sensationalized to attract attention. But those arguments fail to erase the consistent reports from miners, archaeologists, and native legends alike, describing something extraordinary within those cave walls. The sheer volume of artifacts alone shows that Lovelock Cave was a significant site, a hub of activity for ancient people with advanced craftsmanship and mysterious origins. The bones, the sandals, the tools, the hair, each piece of evidence adds another layer to the enigma. Who were these people? Why were they so different? And if the miners' stories about the missing skeletons are true, what happened to them? As the years passed after the initial excavations at Lovelock Cave, a strange cloud began to form over the entire discovery. The cave, once hailed as an archaeological treasure trove, started to fade from public attention, not because it lacked intrigue, but because too many questions had begun to surface. And at the center of those questions stood one of the most powerful institutions in American history, the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian Institution has always been viewed as the gatekeeper of American archaeology, the final word on what counts as history and what doesn't. But when it comes to Lovelock Cave, whispers began to spread that the Smithsonian might have known far more than it was willing to share. According to accounts from miners, locals, and even a few early researchers, giant skeletons unearthed at Lovelock were allegedly collected by agents of the Smithsonian for further study, yet, when modern historians and researchers tried to trace these remains, there was no record of them ever being received. They were gone, vanished. This wasn't just idle speculation. Newspaper articles from the early 1900s described giant skeletons and mummified remains being sent off for analysis, with measurements well over 7 feet tall. But the Smithsonian's official reports made no mention of any such remains. Instead, the bones were simply described as human and consistent with local populations. That discrepancy sparked decades of debate. Were the early reports exaggerated? Or was something being intentionally covered up? For those who believe in what's called forbidden archaeology, the Smithsonian's alleged role in the Lovelock mystery is part of a much larger pattern, a pattern of suppressing discoveries that challenged the conventional timeline of human history. According to this theory, any evidence suggesting the existence of advanced or non-standard human species in North America is quietly removed, mislabeled or buried in archives never meant to be opened again. The reason? Such discoveries would append everything we've been taught about the peopling of the Americas, evolution, and ancient civilization itself. Consider this. The early miners who first entered the cave in 1911 claimed they found several complete skeletons before the University of California team ever arrived. These skeletons, according to their reports, were massive, easily over 7 feet in height, with skulls larger than normal. The miners claimed that some of these bones were handed over to authorities, possibly representatives linked to the Smithsonian or local museums. But within a few short years, all mention of them disappeared from the official record. When modern researchers tried to follow the paper trail, they hit a wall. Letters, shipping records, and correspondence from that era either didn't exist or had mysteriously gone missing. Even the University of California's published field notes contained only vague references to unusually large bones, with no physical specimens surviving in their collection. For many, this was the smoking gun, proof that something was deliberately being kept out of the public eye. Skeptics, of course, argue that there's a far simpler explanation. They suggest that the so-called giant bones were mismeasured, that early reports were sensationalized by newspapers looking for headlines, and that the Smithsonian never received any such remains because they never truly existed. Yet that explanation doesn't account for the sheer consistency of eyewitness testimonies, not just from miners, but from local officials and even museum workers who later spoke about what they had seen. One of the more provocative claims came from researchers decades later who alleged that the Smithsonian had an unofficial policy in the early 20th century to dispose of anomalous human remains, anything that didn't fit neatly into accepted evolutionary models. Though there's no concrete proof of such a policy, the idea persists because of how many similar stories exist across the United States. Reports of giant bones discovered in burial mounds, newspaper articles describing skeletons of enormous size, and eyewitness accounts of bones being taken away by unidentified men all seem to follow the same pattern. In the case of Lovelock Cave, the pattern is unmistakable. First come the discoveries, extraordinary finds that defy explanation, then the involvement of official institutions, and finally the disappearance. It's as if every time something is found that doesn't align with the accepted narrative, it's quietly erased from the story of America's past. But why would anyone want to hide the existence of giant humans? The answer, some say, lies in the implications. If a race of enormous, red-haired people truly lived in North America thousands of years ago, it would mean rewriting history from the ground up. It would mean acknowledging that our ancestors weren't the first, that other advanced or non-human species may have walked these lands long before us. It would call into question everything from human migration patterns to the very origins of civilization. For the Smithsonian, an institution built on maintaining the official record of human history, such an admission would be seismic. The narrative of gradual human evolution, the established timelines of indigenous cultures, even the story of how the Americas were first populated, all of it would be thrown into chaos. And for some, that's reason enough to make inconvenient evidence disappear. To this day, there are researchers who have filed Freedom of Information requests, written letters, and scoured archives in search of the Lovelock bones. None have been able to locate them. The artifacts, baskets, decoys, and tools are real, carefully preserved in museums, but the alleged skeletons? Not one remains publicly available for examination. Even more curious, when journalists have attempted to interview Smithsonian representatives about the Lovelock discoveries, the responses are always the same. There's no record, no bones, and no evidence that giants ever existed. Case closed. Yet, in a world where data can vanish and narratives can be shaped, that official silence only fuels more suspicion. And so, the question remains, did the Smithsonian truly lose track of the Lovelock skeletons, or were they never meant to be found again? Were they simply a miner's myth gone out of control, or was there something far greater buried, not just in the sands of Nevada, but in the archives of history itself? When news of Lovelock Cave's discoveries began to spread, the public fascination was immediate. Newspapers called it one of the strangest archaeological finds in the American West, a cave filled with giant bones, ancient tools, and red-haired mummies that seemed to confirm tribal legends. But as soon as scientists stepped in, the story began to fracture into two competing realities: the version accepted by mainstream archaeology, and the one whispered about by those who believed the truth had been buried along with the bones. On one side stood the scholars, men of science from universities, and museums who insisted that everything found at Lovelock could be explained within the boundaries of known history. They argued that there were no giants, no lost race, no mystery to unravel. According to their reports, the so-called oversized bones were simply misidentified or exaggerated by miners unfamiliar with archaeological procedures. The reddish hair, they claimed, wasn't never red at all. It had turned that color over time due to chemical reactions with the cave's mineral-rich soil. To them, this was a straightforward case of ancient Native American remains, nothing more, nothing less. But the other side told a different story. Independent researchers, local historians, and even some early eyewitnesses argued that something about Lovelock Cave didn't fit the academic explanation. They pointed out the sheer number of consistent reports describing unusually large bones, oversized sandals, and skulls that didn't match the normal human proportions. If these were simply tall people, why were the remains and tools so disproportionate? Why were there accounts of 7, 8, even 9-foot skeletons being removed before official excavations began? The more the scientific establishment tried to downplay the discoveries, the more people began to suspect there was something to hide. This suspicion gave rise to what became known as the Forbidden Archaeology movement, a belief that evidence of advanced or non-human ancient civilizations has been systematically suppressed to protect the current understanding of human history. And Lovelock Cave, many said, was a prime example of that suppression. For mainstream archaeologists, however, the explanation was simple. The cave had been occupied by early Native Americans, likely ancestors of the Paiute tribe. The artifacts, baskets, tools, and duck decoys showed remarkable craftsmanship, but they weren't out of place in the region's known prehistoric cultures. The supposed giant bones, they claimed, were either from exceptionally tall individuals or the result of mismeasurement, and those sensational reports from miners and early newspapers, just exaggerations, distorted by rumor and the allure of profit. Yet that explanation doesn't sit well with everyone. Because when you dig deeper into the reports, the photographs, and the testimonies, the mainstream version begins to look a little too tidy. Some of the earliest field notes mention bones described as large and unusual. Early photos show skulls that appear elongated and broad, unlike typical Native American remains. And then there's the mystery of the missing skeletons, which no official institution has ever been able to account for. This conflict between science and speculation isn't unique to Lovelock Cave. Similar stories have appeared across the United States, from giant bones found in Midwestern burial mounds to enormous skulls unearthed in California and Arizona. Each time, the same pattern emerges. The discovery makes headlines, experts step in, and the evidence quietly disappears. The Lovelock case, then, is not an isolated anomaly. It's part of a recurring historical pattern that challenges how we define truth in archaeology. Even within academia, there are those who admit that human history may be more complex than we've been taught. Genetic studies have revealed migrations and civilizations that were unknown just a few decades ago. Entire cultures have vanished from history books only to be rediscovered through modern technology. So, when alternative researchers suggest that Lovelock Cave might hold evidence of a forgotten branch of humanity, one, physically distinct and culturally advanced, it doesn't sound entirely impossible. There are theories that the Lovelock giants could have been remnants of a lost race connected to early seafaring peoples, perhaps descendants of ancient explorers who crossed the Pacific or the remnants of an even older global civilization. Others go further, suggesting they might have been a hybrid species, the result of crossbreeding between humans and something else entirely. These ideas, while rejected by mainstream science, have gained traction in alternative archaeology circles, where Lovelock is seen as a key piece of a much larger puzzle linking giant legends across the globe. Science, of course, demands proof, DNA, bones, verifiable data, and while a handful of samples from Lovelock Cave have been tested, the results have never been made fully public. Some claim DNA analysis revealed ordinary human origins, while others insist that the results were inconclusive or suppressed. The truth, as usual, depends on who you ask. What makes the debate so compelling is that both sides believe they're protecting the truth. The scientists see themselves as defending reason and evidence against sensationalism. The alternative historians see themselves as uncovering secrets that powerful institutions want to keep hidden. The clash between these two worlds, the rational and the forbidden, is what keeps the legend of Lovelock alive. One thing everyone agrees on is that the cave itself holds layers of history that we still don't fully understand. The artifacts are real, the human occupation is real, but the nature of those first inhabitants, who they were, how they lived, and why their physical remains sparked such controversy, remains shrouded in mystery. Whether the red-haired Giants of Lovelock were a tribe of unusually tall humans, a misunderstood culture lost to time, or something that science has yet to explain, one fact can't be denied. Every time someone steps into that cave, they step into a mystery that defies easy answers. Lovelock doesn't just challenge archaeology, it challenges belief itself. More than a century has passed since the first miners dug into Lovelock Cave, and yet the mystery refuses to fade. If anything, time has only made it stronger. The cave, quiet and remote in the Nevada desert, still stands where it always has, a gaping mouth carved into the rock, filled with shadows and echoes of the past. But for modern researchers, the question isn't just what was found there, it's what was lost, what's been hidden, and what secrets still linger beneath the surface. Over the decades, archaeologists have returned to Lovelock again and again, each time hoping to separate fact from legend. They've mapped the cave, re-examined the artifacts, and sifted through records from the original excavations. Yet for every answer they find, new questions seem to emerge. Many of the artifacts, the reed duck decoys, the woven baskets, and the stone tools are now carefully preserved in museums like the Nevada State Museum and the Smithsonian's own collections. But the remains that allegedly started the entire legend, the giant bones, the red-haired skulls, the towering skeletons, are nowhere to be found. Some modern archaeologists say that the mystery has been exaggerated, that early newspaper accounts sensationalized the story to attract attention. But others argue that the missing evidence isn't a coincidence, that something valuable was removed, something that could have rewritten the story of humanity in North America. In an age when almost everything can be documented, photographed, and shared, the absence of tangible proof has only fueled more speculation. Independent researchers and alternative historians have made Lovelock Cave a kind of pilgrimage site. They come armed with cameras, ground-penetrating radar, and an unshakable determination to uncover the truth. Some claim to have found new evidence, large handprints embedded in the cave's clay walls, strange red fibers matching the ancient descriptions, and traces of fire that could support the Paiute legend of the giants being burned alive. Others have collected DNA samples from bone fragments and hair strands reportedly linked to the cave's earlier discoveries. But even here, the mystery deepens. DNA results that have surfaced publicly are inconsistent. Some show typical Native American origins, while others are labeled inconclusive due to contamination or degradation. There are whispers that private labs conducting independent testing have been pressured to stay silent, while official institutions dismiss these stories as pseudoscience. The line between myth and reality grows thinner with each passing year. In the digital age, Lovelock Cave has become more than just an archaeological site. It's become a symbol. On social media, in documentaries, and in countless podcasts, people debate whether the cave once housed a lost race of red-haired giants, or whether it's all just a fascinating case of mistaken identity. Conspiracy channels point to patterns. Similar stories of red-haired beings appear in native legends from the Great Lakes to the Pacific Northwest. They argue that Lovelock is only one chapter in a much larger global story about forgotten civilizations erased from history. Meanwhile, mainstream scientists continue to dig literally and figuratively, searching for definitive answers. They've used modern dating methods to analyze charcoal and organic matter from the cave, confirming that human occupations stretched back thousands of years. They've examined the surviving artifacts with new technology, revealing incredible craftsmanship and advanced techniques for their time. But none of it explains the giant bones, the missing mummies, or the persistent tribal stories that refuse to die. Even the local community around Lovelock has felt the pull of the legend. Residents tell of strange activity near the cave, sightings of tall, shadowy figures at night, unmarked vehicles visiting the site, and researchers who come quietly and leave without saying much. Some say the cave still holds sealed chambers that were never fully excavated. Others believe that the real evidence was removed long ago and stored in secret collections beyond public reach. One of the most intriguing modern claims came from a team of amateur researchers who said they found ancient petroglyphs in the surrounding area depicting large humanoid figures towering over smaller ones. The carvings, though weathered, seem to echo the old Paiute stories of giants who once ruled the land. Archaeologists acknowledge that such rock art exists, but caution against interpreting it literally. Still, for those seeking validation of the legend, every symbol, every carving, and every whisper of evidence feels like another piece of the puzzle. In recent years, renewed interest in ancient mysteries has brought Lovelock Cave back into the spotlight. Television crews and YouTube documentarians have revisited the site, blending historical research with speculation. Some have compared the Lovelock giants to similar legends found around the world, the Nephilim of the Bible, the Anakim of Canaan, and the giants of South America's pre-Columbian myths. They suggest that humanity's collective memory of giants might not be myth at all, but fragmented history distorted over millennia. Despite all the attention, one thing remains constant: the unanswered questions. Where are the original skeletons supposedly found by the miners in 1911? Why do early reports describe details that are completely absent from modern archaeological records? And if there truly were red-haired, giant beings living in ancient Nevada, what became of them? Did they die out, or were they systematically erased from history by those who feared what their existence might reveal? Every layer of Lovelock Cave tells a story, but not all of those stories have been told. Some are buried under centuries of sediment and secrecy. Others linger in the voices of the Paiute elders, who still speak of the Sideka, the red-haired people who once lived and died beneath the Nevada sun. Science continues to test, measure, and analyze, searching for data to fit within its framework. But there are things about Lovelock that don't fit, that refuse to be categorized or explained away. And that's why the legend still holds power, because somewhere deep in that cave or hidden in an archive drawer might lie the evidence that changes everything we know about the ancient past. Lovelock Cave isn't just an archaeological site. It has a question mark carved into the American desert, one that keeps daring us to look closer, to question harder, and to ask whether history as we know it has been only half told. As we reach the end of this journey through time, one thing becomes clear. Lovelock Cave is more than just a hole in the Nevada desert. It's a riddle carved in stone, a whisper from a forgotten era that refuses to be silenced. From the moment guano miners unearthed strange artifacts and massive bones in 1911, the story of this cave has defied simple explanation. It has drawn scientists, skeptics, and seekers alike into its shadowy depths, each hoping to find the truth behind the legend of the red-haired giants. The Paiute people's tales of the Sideka, fierce and towering beings who once roamed the land, have endured for generations. These stories are not written in books but carried in memory, in the songs, the warnings, and the fireside retellings that long predate any modern archaeology. Whether these giants were real beings or mythic symbols of ancient struggle, their story speaks to something universal, the human instinct to remember what came before, even when the world wants to forget. The discoveries inside Lovelock, the woven sandals, the duck decoys, the tools, the mummified remains, each piece hints at a complex culture buried beneath centuries of dust. Yet, the more we learn, the more we lose. Artifacts vanish into collections, records are rewritten, and the bones that once sparked global curiosity have seemingly disappeared without a trace. Some say this is coincidence. Others believe it as deliberate, a cover-up meant to protect a version of history that fits neatly within accepted boundaries. But history is rarely neat. It's messy, unpredictable, and full of contradictions. The Giants of Lovelock stand as a reminder that the past is far stranger than we often imagine. Whether they were ancient humans of unusual size, remnants of a forgotten race, or misunderstood myths, they've carved their mark into our collective curiosity. Even now, modern technology hasn't solved the mystery. DNA tests offer inconclusive answers, archaeologists argue over interpretations, and new explorers continue to search for lost evidence. Each new discovery brings a glimmer of hope that maybe one day we'll uncover definitive proof of who or what once lived in Lovelock Cave, but maybe the real power of this story isn't in finding bones or relics. Maybe it's in what it tells us about ourselves, our hunger for truth, our fascination with the forbidden, and our willingness to challenge what we've been told. The legend of the Lovelock Giants reminds us that history is not a closed book. It's a living story still being written. So, as we leave the silence of that desert cave behind, one question continues to echo through time. What if the Paiute legends were right? What if, long before the first settlers arrived, America was home to an ancient race that defied explanation, a race that once walked tall beneath the sun and left behind only whispers, bones, and shadows in a cave?